He also had what was called his surgical
River king. It grows here naturally in Florida. Very fine.
100.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Bob. First off, microphone's good. And OK, we're good. I'm going to start my timer so I don't get too far off here. All right, hi. Like Bob said, I'm Chris Altez. I'm here. I'm excited to be here. Talk about voyaging, events or eventful contact and computer models. Whoa, OK. Some of these things are ideas I'm still working on and still kind of formulating, so I'm really happy to get some feedback other than like the little bubble of people I talk with every day. And over the course of the presentation, I promise the graphics will get better. They're going to start out kind of weak. So first, I'm going to talk about kind of what I'm thinking about open water voyaging to open the conversation in real general terms. Then a case study of how we can kind of apply this to fiber-tempered pottery in the New World. And then finally, to focus more on what I think about more often, which is the Caribbean and the division between the Caribbean and North America, which we think of as the straits between Florida and Cuba. I live and work in Florida on a daily basis, but I'm always thinking about the Caribbean, so that's kind of why I'm zeroed in there. So this gap is important to me professionally and personally. We all have a general understanding of what I mean by voyaging. I don't mean kind of the quick trip to the reef to gather food in the past or today, or just visiting neighbors. This is normal activity. This is what happens on a kind of a daily or weekly scale. I mean, this is me every day. So really, that's not what I'm talking about when for these models. Beyond that, there's kind of the regular or seasonal trader movement. This would include my coming here to St. Petersburg from Gainesville, or this photo, which captures it pretty well, because you can see the scale in terms of time with the tree in the background, and in terms of social groups. Those are my parents. This can be very regular, and don't tell my parents this, not always particularly memorable. The outermost scales here we're talking about are the unexpected and the eventful. These are vacations, migrations, and beyond. It might not be clear here, but I'm at a conference in Martinique at an old rum distillery. Different place, they don't speak English, different money, different food. I haven't been there before, and I haven't been since. So kind of these are the scales I'm talking about here. These are what I conceive of when I'm talking about open water voyaging. They include both these yearly, seasonal kind of trips and the once-in-a-lifetime trips, which I hope Martinique's not once in a lifetime. I'd love to go back, but life being what it is. Much of my ideas here come from kind of the ethnographic work in the South Pacific and the Kula Ring and around New Guinea. So I don't say anything outright, or if I say something about how people do this, that's what I'm basing it on. And so drawing on these examples and my understanding of Caribbean archaeology, I think of it as a stool. It has three elements. And this might, when I say the graphics are kind of lame, this is what I'm talking about. I really like it, but other people who have seen it say, really? So you need three legs to stand. And so first, I've got a person. When dealing with computer models in particular, GIS and archaeology, people tend to forget that we're talking about people. So let's put them in first. People make choices, and they're key. But people, first off, need to have a reason to make choices. They need to kind of have just a baseline reason to go and venture out. And then they need a means and a ways of travel. And I'm labeling all this because, like I said, it's kind of hard to see that that's a canoe and not just a brown shape. So then they need an avenue to travel through and the technology to follow the avenue. For me today, this can kind of be outlined as follows. I wanted to come to St. Petersburg tonight. I drew upon past experience of where St. Petersburg was, and still is, as it turns out, and took I-75 to get here. I could have taken other routes, but that's the way I went. I drove my truck down here, which I knew could get me through I-75, and what I'm going to address next, which are the impediments in the harrowing journey that is Tampa at rush hour. So in the past, you would need an actor, which, let's see if we can get this, there we go. an actor with knowledge and desires to go somewhere and a means of getting there. These are the baseline before we kind of get to where most of the research here is going. So let's go. Okay, so these are the impediments. These are the Tampa at rush hour that I'm talking about. These are the constraints. The first off is familiar. You can't really take a canoe everywhere. There are some problems. I have up there you can't sail to Utah. But that can be overcome by some technology, but it's generally a structural constraint to any model. Then there are other hazards, such as reefs, other people, and hostile critters. They can't block the way, but they can actually prevent or make you go in another route. They're agents and can reshape kind of your actions. We can think of this also in terms of voyaging and migration. When Ponce de Leon tried to come to this part of Florida, it wasn't very successful. He ended up with an arrow in him, right? Okay, so the third category is not necessarily an impediment, but as I'll show in a bit, it can be. These are the currents and the winds. Anyone who's been ocean kayaking out in the bay and tried to come back in as the current's going out knows that they're a force to be reckoned with, and you can end up way out in the Gulf. And then in Florida and the Caribbean, we can't forget the 900-pound gorilla, the hurricane. It's a radical game-changing force that's not really in my models unless on accident, which I can show you in a second. So voyaging has its hazards, and we have to consider them first. But back to the people and why they would travel. As I conceive of these ancient sea voyagers, they have to have as minimum 4 qualities. First, they're cosmopolitan. Oh, and that's me, if it's not clear. They're aware of and interact with a wider array of other people than the gloss we label as archaeological cultures for descriptive purposes. They're engaging with a diverse, broader world with different identities, and it's complicated and messy. Second, I see them as knowledgeable. They may not have had satellite imagery like that hurricane, but they would have known when a hurricane was coming, which way the wind was blowing that day, and where it was likely to go the next. They know how to travel over the water and find sites of land. Thirdly, I have them as, I conceive of people in the past as curious. They want to know what's out there so they can really get a better understanding of the world. I know it's unscientific to say that, but it's helpful for me as I walk through these models to think of people as curious, that they would be making voyages. Fourth is another reason to make voyages, which is people are ambitious. It plays into curiosity. They want to know what's out there so they can better their own lives and that of their families. I don't get into this here, but particularly in kind of the unilateral descent systems, which fit the preponderance of small-scale societies that I'm kind of talking about here, competition between small groups with shared identities is key. So in short, I see myself, ourselves in the past in terms of voyaging. A simple illustration here of just kind of people moving around is to ask how many people here were actually born in St. Petersburg. Okay, that's Florida? Okay, yeah. So people move for a variety of reasons, but tracing this movement is difficult. I have nothing on my person right now which would tell you I'm from Jacksonville. So an archaeologist would never see that. So we have to use artifacts. And so here I'm looking at fiber-tempered pottery to start with. The observation that fiber-tempered pottery styles can be found across early traditions in the Americas is not new. Ford and Bullen both published on it in the 60s and 70s. In a review of early American pottery, Meggers suggests that pottery from Florida and Georgia is somehow related to Ecuadorian traditions without really a mechanism. Augusto Ohuela Consejo, and that's the last time I'm going to say his name, he calls himself OC, I'll follow his lead, has written that such visions of dispersal from like Ecuador to Georgia are really simplistic and generally disregard some data points, and they're overly diffusionistic. And he says they discount the ingenuity of the local groups. I suggest that we can look at the kind of technological similarities, but also use things like currents and bioarchaeology to really get a better look then of how such things would have happened and if there could be a connection there. So the southeastern United States has long claimed the oldest pottery in North America, this fiber-tempered pottery series. It looks like it originates somewhere around South Georgia. It is mostly found in Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Alabamas. There is a bias issue here, as Reed and Skibo in the past have talked about how in colder climates they would disintegrate because the pottery is so low fired and kind of not very hard. And but that makes it lighter than paste with mineral inclusion, so it's ideal for if you're on the move and a very mobile people. We tend to think that these people are simple because we link kind of pottery, or earliest pottery, with just the cutting edge of the Neolithic transition. So these are the earliest pottery dates, and I'll get to them in a second, that we have, or that I have available. Recent research in South America has uncovered ancient fiber-tempered pottery traditions going back much further than we used to think about. OC has documented fiber-tempered pottery at San Jacinto 1 to approximately 5,000 BP, which is down here. And Anna Roosevelt has found pottery in contexts that date to over 7,000 BP at Taparina and Pedro Pinata. Roosevelt further suggests that there might be even other older dates that archaeologists haven't reported because they didn't fit existing dominant culture history schemes, which is kind of a radical thing to say and sounds like fighting words. And then despite historic academic dismissal of pre-Arawakon pottery in the Caribbean, so that would be before about 500 BC, by Irving Rouse, more recent evaluations of it by Rodriguez Ramos and Keegan and Alice Sampson have indicated that so-called archaic or lithic age inhabitants of the Greater Antilles had a long tradition of ceramic production. What's more, it's being found up in here, not down in here, which is presumably where the people who had pottery later in the Caribbean were coming from. Curiously, the earliest dates cited are in Cuba at Cayo Juria, when you can see that right around here. Cuba, though, is still largely a black box to American archaeologists. We don't know everything going on in there. The pottery there includes fiber-tempered varieties, something that's absent in the Arawakon, again, that's post-500 BC pottery series. So later pottery doesn't look like the early stuff there and looks like a completely separate tradition. So how could these areas relate? This is a current model, models the ocean currents out there. And this is designed to be a particle flow model. It works essentially like a message in a bottle computer simulation. It doesn't have the kind of variability of probabilistic modeling. It's very mechanical, but it provides a general idea of the flow. Where the bottle is thrown into the sea, the currents control exactly where it ends up. There's no steering or attempts to reach land. So it's not meant to reflect all the possibilities of open water voyaging, but only offer a glimpse of kind of the dominant way to go of the affordances within the basin. So in this model, it changed direction every 17 miles, which is every half step being these little cells that the arrows are coming from. This is not how the data is, but this is kind of a useful heuristic for displaying it. You can see the coarseness of it. Each one of those cells comprises 34 by 34 miles. By the end, we'll compare it to another model, and you can see that it's pretty ugly. So the particle flow model, when you run it, and it had to be this coarse in part because my poor laptop here can't handle that much more when we start running lots of simulations. But when we start from where the earliest pottery dates were, down at San Jacinto 1, which is right here, and run the model, it goes directly from Colombia to Cuba, bypassing the Yucatan or other down-the-line trading through the presumably safer passage through the Lesser Antilles. And this matches models created by Richard Callahan, who's a professor in Canada, who's been showing that if you start down around here, it's much easier to sail to this region than go all the way through there, and much faster. Another important note here is that the model doesn't lead you into, say, where we are now in Tampa Bay or anywhere in Southwest Florida, but actually jumps down, hits Cuba, and then runs you back up the coast to where the area in the southeast where Sassman has placed the origin of fiber-tempered pottery, right there where Florida and Georgia come together. This wasn't planned. This is what happened when I put the data in and asked where does it go, which made me really excited. In stopping for a moment, I don't mean to say that people did this all at once, just decide one day let's up and move to Florida like people do today. I think people probably move back and forth along this kind of corridor over time, and possibly bringing things like fiber-tempered pottery with them. So it doesn't mean necessarily population replacement either, just that you're seeing contact along here. And things like technology and possibly even language could be passed along the way. The time estimates here are meant to be relative. I'm not wedded to them. But even more conservative modeling of time would still fit within time frames that Richard Callahan says people survive on accidental open water voyaging. So all of this adds to data published recently suggesting links between Florida, Cuba, and northern South America. On the left, we have craniomorphometrics, which are very precise measurements of where the bones are in relation to each other in your face, or actually skeletal populations' faces. And on the right are dental traits, which are about 80 to 85% heritable, and that is looking at the exact way, particularly your molars, all the peaks and valleys relate to each other. So the dental morphological traits link Florida and northwestern South America, discriminating it from later Caribbean populations, which you can see here. And so do the morphometrical facial measurements. This was not what the researchers were intending in their write-ups of this data. This is kind of they're struggling for a way to explain it. And so in both instances, Florida, northern South America, and Cuba form separate populations than the populations of the rest of the Caribbean. This kind of supports something else, another oddity recently in Florida archaeology. In Brian Tucker's dissertation work, he's now as of I think this week, the state archaeologist of Georgia. Isotopic bone signatures, initially regarded as outliers or even errors in one of the archaic Florida burial mounds, suggested that one of the people there was from the Caribbean. So that's the kind of thing that is formed when he was sampling teeth, and the isotope signatures in your teeth are formed when you're little, because our teeth are formed when we're little, and then they fall in. And some of the chemicals in there look like they're not from Florida, but from points south, which, of course, that's not supposed to happen when you're looking at archaic populations in Florida. Furthermore, linguistic analysis by Granberry has suggested that the Timucua languages are Arawakan in nature, suggesting they're pre-Marpurian Arawakan, dating to about 5,000 BP, which is the exact same time period that fiber-tempered pottery could have been moving through here. So we have genetics, we have pottery, and we also have possibly linguistic descent here. I mean, it adds up, it's a lot. This is not to discount the notion that the southeastern United States or Cuba weren't cultural hearths for the invention of pottery. Because I don't mean to suggest that the indigenous people lack the creativity or intelligence to do so. Rather, it just suggests that people didn't lack creativity, but could in fact be engaging with a much larger world, moving much farther than, say, the archaeologists who study them, because how many Florida archaeologists get down to Cuba to study the fiber-tempered pottery there? So I'm thinking these people were probably engaged in much longer distance travel and trade and kinship patterns than we're thinking about when, say, we label sites and artifact classes that stop at state lines and label these people as bands of hunter-gatherers rather than a fairly complex society. Some of the Stone Age inhabitants of the Americas, in fact, looks like they traveled more widely and were way more knowledgeable than I probably will ever be. So in short, the currents here separated rather than serving as a barrier. Beginning with this perspective, I started to do a more kind of localized exploration of the winds and currents. I'd like to show some of those models now. Like I said, the graphics get better. And it makes it a lot cooler to present when you have this. So to quote two things from popular research, or from popular culture for this research that kind of helped me here. The first is the old joke by Dodge and Bryan about New Englanders, which is you can't get there from here. And the second is written by Zemeckis and Gale, but we're more familiar with it by Emmett Brown. Roads, where we're going, we don't need roads. And so in this case, water connects land. The straits, lakes, and oceans collapse distances rather than actually being impediments. Now we draw country boundaries where they meet the water, whereas in the past that doesn't need to be the case. That could actually be what holds places together. Given the prevalence of maritime adaptations in canoes in the past, why does the study of southeastern archaeology and Florida archaeology stop at the edge of Florida? And why do those of us who study Caribbean archaeology not look at Florida? This divide, the apparent natural barrier between Florida and the Greater Antilles, really provides a useful study for this kind of modeling and assessing the archaeological record. The models are only meant to explore possible relationships because I don't have any good artifactual evidence for a lot of this. And it's an alternative to kind of traditional dismissal, offhand dismissal, of Caribbean-Florida connections. And so this is a different computer program. It's called SARMAP. I did the other stuff in GIS. This was actually developed for search and rescue operations. So the idea being you put a guy in the water and look at where he ends up, possibly. It also can be done to do contraband modeling, which is stuff washes up on the beach and the Coast Guard wants to know where it came from. The program is used by the Coast Guard and the Navy and was recently used. This is the one that shows the, hurricane. You saw everyone shift at once. It's kind of hypnotic. In any case, this is also used during the Deepwater Horizon incident, the BP oil spill, to try to figure out where the oil would go. Okay, so focusing more narrowly between Florida and Cuba, you can see the model is much finer. And also, it's got all these little interesting artifacts like this swirl here, which isn't at all time. And these are taken at 6-hour intervals from NOAA data primarily. And it's ocean and wind currents. So the obvious, and this is the general explanation as to why we don't see contact between the Greater Antilles and Florida, the strength of the Gulf Stream here. It's seen usually as some kind of barrier. So this research began with the question of, is it really, can we kind of punch, given these models that are somewhat randomized, can you get through this kind of structural impediment? Because we know just after contact, people were sailing from this area up here to escape the Spanish, and then at one point, a group of Seminole did make this trek here. So they obviously, it was possible people could do it, but why do we dismiss it in the past? So is the Gulf Stream a shield, or could it possibly actually be a highway? After testing dozens of locations with at least 100 iterations, which is largely me telling my computer to do things and just walking away for the rest of the day, very few modeled locations ended up safely crossing the Straits of Florida. This includes me starting from all over the Caribbean just to see what would happen, starting from the Yucatan and a series of locations in Florida and backtrack modeling to see what would be safe. The time frame was limited to a 3-week portion, 2 3-week periods, using a hurricane-free period in July and then a hurricane-free period in August. This was done because I started running these models and I was really excited, and then I kept seeing all the points jump at once. And I kept trying to figure out what was going on there, and then you would look at the news for that day when you go back and you realize that all of my data was being skewed by massive hurricanes coming through. So here are some of the models of leaving Cuba. And so each one of these is engaging in what's called a random walk within the parameters of the winds and the currents. And random walks are used in economics and anthropology. Basically, every iteration, there's slight variations. And it's a Monte Carlo method, meaning that there's a whole bunch of them at once, basically. So you can see the range of possibilities. So Western Cuba, which is here, has been described as a culturally backward portion of the Caribbean from the Chronicles on. In terms of archaeology and history, it tends to be kind of denigrated over here. It's actually thought about as people as wretched savages without the benefit of agriculture and civilization. Jago Cooper, an archaeologist in England, has recently completed a survey of all the known sites in Cuba and has no, what we would call ceramic age, or I'm going to butcher this word, agrolifero sites out here. So that's what we think of in the Caribbean as complex societies. He suggests there might be some survey bias because most of the sites are in rock shelters and caves, but doesn't really offer an alternative. Eastern Cuba, that's Western Cuba, there we go. Eastern Cuba has been grouped with the larger Caribbean traditions, such as those found in Hispaniola and the Bahamas, in both traditional, which would be Irving Rouse, is the traditional culture history of the Caribbean, and more recent, people like Cooper's models of how things were going in the past. The models from this portion of Cuba, from Eastern Cuba, really don't go anywhere, which I'll address in a second. But I really believe it's really telling that these are the parts that are grouped down here to other parts of the Caribbean, and the little flea circus doesn't travel too far. So you can do the opposite. So rather than asking how do points leave Cuba, how do they get to Florida? So this is putting the endpoint in and asking the model to give me places where it could end up. And I put the endpoint at Miami. I used to live at Miami. I was curious. There's some big sites there. And you can see it's all in that western end of Cuba, the part that's supposed to be somewhat culturally backward. I think some of the outliers here, which are the ones that end up successfully or unsuccessfully, can be taken to be deliberate actions. Since these are random walks, a lot of the ones that make it to land, if you zoom in and look at them carefully, are actually taking a step in the same direction each time. Whereas the ones that take the wrong step each time would again be directed travel, people trying to go in some direction. Even given this random walk model, at least 4% of all voyages pass within 1 kilometer of Florida, and 12% within 4 kilometers of Florida, leaving western Cuba. This would be, I'm sorry, north central Cuba. And this would be within the range of what you could see by land without even needing to know about cloud sign and birds and things like that. Though it's not a high percentage, it's actually higher than what Richard Callahan has been reporting as when he thinks of successful voyaging in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. So not only is it possibly successful, it's more successful than places we know there were contacts. The next few slides show you how to then process the data, which is taking out like the points at 6-hour intervals, which looks like a mess, but you kind of need it in order to make something like this, which is a bit more understandable, where you can see each of the modeled voyages and how they end up, which is, I think, really good for thinking about this and thinking about where you would go and safety. Stoplight is one of my favorites because this makes you think about, this is actually time, how far kind of each distance would be. I go with stoplight colors because we easily understand green is safe, orange you need to start looking for land, and red you're dead. So then I can present it like this, and I'm going to use this format for other locations, and then first I'm going to talk about these other locations. So this is the distance from Cuba. This is just a histogram showing how far the journey went, and that says axis tidal, but it's iterations. And you can see most started slow, or didn't go far. Those are ones that never left land. But a few of them made it almost 1,000 kilometers away, just within the 3-week period. Which really, when you think about it, that's a long way away. That's your 3-hour tour on the minnow right there. Whereas the rest of these, the bulk of them kind of stayed in a very safe range. This is running the same time using the same data starting into the Tampa Bay area, actually a little bit south of the Tampa Bay area. And you can see that we really don't get very far. They stay clustered in. The modeled voyagers never venture that far out. And that's true both on the August data, and the June data. It's skewed a little bit, but it's a very stable area, and I'll get to why that's really cool later. I thought it was disappointing at first. As another point, I started in Key West. In the August data, you can see at least a couple of them pass kind of close to Cuba, but again, it's relatively conservative. But then the June data, I don't know if you remember that swirl when we were looking at the currents, but one of them ended up out there. And when you're watching the data get processed, you're really rooting for the little individual dots to make it somewhere. And so when one ends up out there, you're kind of disappointed. But you can see a whole lot more make it down around Cuba there. These are the total distances using the 3 areas. Basically, the farther out, the longer this line takes to reach 100%, the more dangerous it is, the farther out the modeled voyages go. And these 3 over here are the 2 from Cuba and one of the ones from Key West. And these 3 right here are the ones from around Pineland, south of here, and one of the Key West ones, which I take to mean not only is the voyage possible, it's probable, but it doesn't happen the way we think about it. When we think about exchange, it's usually I go someplace, hand you something, and you give me something back. And that's how we look for it archaeologically. We look for what one artifact is kind of out of place. So here, the model that looks like it works is going like this. It's starting in Cuba, going to Florida, bouncing around to another part of Florida, and coming back out, with then other little branches of the network moving out. The fact that you didn't have that kind of stochastic or random variation here in Cuba or up here in Florida is actually very telling. If you want to build, it's part of the conditions you need to build a complex society is reliable transportation, the ability to talk with your neighbors, talk with your kin, talk with your allies, or attack your enemies. And that really can't be done in this area here. But this area here could serve as a bridge between areas where that could be done. And the fact you can't have these kind of stable networks form, or you can, they'd just be very difficult, in this little area might account for some of the archaeological patterns we're seeing. And then back to one of the first slides I showed, which is talking about how exchange happens in this long-distance trade and voyaging in the Pacific. What we should be looking for primarily are practices involving food and possibly things like the bioarchaeology, because what gets traded there we talk about the cooler ring a lot, and most people are familiar with that. But when they do the cooler ring, yes, they exchange the armbands or the shell necklaces, but they're in canoes full of food. And that's really hard to get at archaeologically, with the one possible exception at Pineland. And in Pineland, what do we find? In one of the few sites that's really been sampled well, you have food that's not from around there. You have peppers and papaya. So I think the stable networks would allow things like the Calusa chiefdoms to form, or these people to be engaged in what we'd like to talk, or gloss as the Taino cultures. But then this would kind of be our exchange corridor to be looking at. So computer models really don't show us ancient social relations or migrations or people. We have to look at other artifact classes for that. But this does show us possibilities. It's still work in progress. I'm really enjoying it, and I hope to get some feedback tonight. This brief review of my most recent attempts at this modeling show how individuals could move across the Caribbean to Florida and back, and illustrate possible avenues for doing so, running all the way from South America to Florida. There's an interesting secondary observation here about the stability of those areas and the fact they didn't have strong currents, or relatively strong currents, in the areas where we do see real complexity happening. And I think that might help explain things like the really strong networks of trade and politics and kin relations that are documented in some of those areas. I'm going to finish up and open up for questions now, unless anyone wants to see another slide or anything like that. Well, that's really cool. So I've been reading up on this a little bit on the east coast of Florida and in the Bahamas, and my dissertation advisor is a Bahamian archaeologist guy. That's his thing. And there's suggestions in the early chronicles of the natives saying things like, the people from Florida come here and raid our birds. So there probably was pretty good crossings back and forth, but we still don't have any artifacts to that effect. And there was the historic migration of Seminole people from Florida to the Bahamas. And it's not, people make the journey now in not big boats, but you'd have to have knowledge that the islands were out there, or you end up way out in the North Atlantic, which just means you have to start a little bit south to kind of swoop in. As far as coming back, Dr. Austin was actually talking about something today that might be an avenue for looking at the cross here, are things like, we're so used to using pottery to label people, but looking at like shell tool traditions, which generally don't get a lot of attention, but we're starting to pay a lot more attention to in the Caribbean, and actually looking at how they're made and what they're used for, and using that as a proxy for knowledge transmission. My current research is actually based in the Turks and Caicos, which is in the Bahamian archipelago. And when I run models around there, it's fairly stable, which means that the points don't go a long way because the water's so shallow, which means if you can break through, which I think people could do, the Gulf Stream, once you cross it, you're kind of set if you can get over into the Bahamas, because they've got those nice shallow banks. There's only a couple deep passages between the Caicos Islands and the rest of the Bahamas, and between the Turks and the Caicos. But we don't have good artifacts to kind of link to that, so we have to look. We're also used to using pottery all the time. And the pottery in the Bahamas in the late ceramic age is very distinctive. It's a red, low-fired earthenware with shell temper that looks pretty gross, called palmetto ware. And one of the problems with it, even on well-preserved sites, it's all in tiny pieces because it's kind of, the shell and the low firing make it not preserve well at all. And there's been suggestions it's been found in Florida before, and it's found in some places in North Cuba. But actually, Bob Carr once thought he found some, but then later walked that back and said it wasn't any. So yeah, there should be some kind of connection there. The models don't really show it very well, but we know it happened historically. So, which is where human agency enters into this. Like I said, these are just kind of possibilities. Once you start putting more people in and having them making decisions and knowing things, you're going to expect to see more things like that. The problem is, how do you test it and how do you find it? A couple of models I ran from there, I didn't show. I've got volumes of this. This filled up a hard drive, basically, all this stuff. I only had this program for a limited amount of time because it's very expensive, and they were kind enough to let me borrow it for a little while. But the models I ran from there, some of them can make it through with the random walks models, but a lot of them do end up basically in North Carolina, where it juts out, and up into Virginia, and points beyond. I'm actually really interested. I have a colleague, a Dutch colleague, who just finished a project working in the Turks and Caicos on these shell-tempered pottery sites. And he's showing that these people are big salt producers. And if you look in the Mississippi Valley at salt producers, they're using shell-tempered pottery. And that is just like, that is beyond what I can kind of conceive of as far as people moving around and not leaving a trace. But it's one of the things he wants to look at in the future is there like a tradition here? Do these things go together? Is there exchange running all the way from these people doing salt production all over the place? Yeah, I'm sorry. If you look at, we have much better ethnographic data about the Pacific. And if you look there, they have maps of the water. And Sean Sullivan, who was an archaeologist in the 70s and 80s, had a find where it's a little bit iffy, but he might have a map of voyaging in the Caribbean laid out in stones in the center of a plaza. But they actually correspond to, if you start where the stones are and line up with Orion, it would get you to Saline, which is one of the largest sites in Haiti. And we know that these people have trade networks running in the Caribbean at least, running all the way from Cuba to South America. Someone recently did a study on some of the gold, and the mineralogy content of it was from South America. So if they're running from Cuba to South America to trade things, it might be down the line, but still that's a giant network. And we know, say, in Miami, at the Miami, not Miami Circle, but across the way, at 8DA 11, there are stuff there from the Piedmont. There's ground stone that when they sourced it was coming from up in the foothills of the Appalachians. Why do we say, well, that's normal? And it's normal for people in Cuba to have stuff from South America. But making that little jump, I mean, it's just, we just don't have the artifacts now. And I think they could read the currents. That's a really promising line of evidence that I don't think anyone's looked at. We've got a guy in the Caribbean now who's tracing out stone tool traditions. Actually, Reniel Rodriguez-Ramos, I mentioned him. He was the one who has the article about fiber-tempered pottery in Cuba, and actually tracing technology traditions of stone tools at a very fine scale. I don't think anyone's looked at it. And like I said, Cuba is such like almost a black hole. Some people are going there from Alabama now, but really, we just don't know a lot. And there's a political barrier there, like you mentioned. And I read some Spanish, but there's a language barrier there for me too. The Cuban archaeologists are hard for me to read. They're using different terms. Surprise, surprise, their perspectives are all very Marxist, which means I've got to kind of rearrange what they're saying to fit more into my understandings of archaeology. I think with more research, I mean, this is speculative, but this research is designed to show it's not only possible, but probable. It works, but we just don't have that kind of artifacts yet. But the bioarchaeology say that there's links. It's just there are links. Those, I forgot to say, those are old sites that were in both instances. The dental morphometric sites were all archaic sites or very late archaic sites. And then the facial morphometric sites were, I need to check, but I think it's places like Tick Island. And I know it's from the caves in Cuba, which are archaic. What we would call here archaic. And there we'd call, oh yeah, we had a great at this site, was it Saba 33? Great manatee burial, manatee butchering station a couple of years ago. I mean, I'm talking like there's pieces of, I think, 4 whole manatees, just like on one level, in a 1x1, which is just so much fun to see, if that's what you like. I sound like a huge dork up here. And so yeah, they were eating manatee, but they weren't, it never disappeared. They were mostly, the diet changed over time. And by the late ceramic age, you're looking at a lot of net fishing probably, and earlier on, they're getting the big fish.
Are you aware of any manatee?
In Florida?
In Florida.
I'd have to check with, actually Bob. I'd have to check with Betsy Carlson, who I work with. I'd have to look around. I know I had dolphin on a site a couple months ago, and that kind of blew my mind, that there was a dolphin head in the unit. Again, I'm sounding like a giant dweeb because I got really excited by that. Yeah, Bob.
What about canoes? Is there canoes?
There are not preserved canoes, but there have been paddles in the Bahamas found in cave contexts.
I guess in Cuba is the black hole, but I mean, have you heard of anything?
I haven't heard of anything in
Or even in South America?
Cuba. We'd have to, well, in South America, a lot of times they use the ethnographic, like Shipibo Canibo canoes. There are drawings of canoes in some of the chronicles, and Richard Callahan actually has gone through all of those and figured out kind of what types of canoes they were.
And are they, I guess where I'm going with this is,
Are you about to make?
stylistically,
Are they Florida canoes? I don't know.
Do they look anything like Florida canoes? Could we have found some of those?
Some.
Yeah.
Well, they use different wood to start with, mostly. As I'm familiar with it, the chronicles talk about it being ceiba trees, which is one of the fascinating things when you look at the spread of people in the Caribbean. There are a lot of people in kind of what we would call complex society, right? Like chiefdoms, big man to chiefdom kind of level, if we're going to talk like that, living on islands that don't get trees big enough for you to grow. Trees don't grow big enough to make canoes out of, but people are living out there. And so you figure people are this is pretty dynamic. I don't know about how you would, I mean, I can think of how you would test it. I've never heard of one in Florida being from the Caribbean.
Right, I mean, the wood is all local. But
And then,
I suppose they could have maybe borrowed some stylistic elements or something.
there was another question about people, the question of like going back and forth to the Yucatan is always really interesting there, because Columbus, when he was sailing along the coast, I'm sorry, not Columbus, later slavers were taking people from the Yucatan over to Florida, and they were escaping and making it back, which suggests that that journey wasn't only possible, but was something they knew how to do. If the people can escape slavery and run home, and they know how to get there. The currents have changed a lot, and actually, the late Archaic is one of the few times the currents were kind of like now. When you talk about things like the various major climatic events in the last several thousand years, they actually would have had big bearing on where kind of the flow of water was and winds were. Unfortunately, these models are not sophisticated enough to capture that. I'm using real world data. I'm using the data provided by NOAA right now. No, you're right. And that's actually, if you look at why people move today, you see a lot of that when you're talking about big migrations. Something we don't think about a lot today, this gets a little bit kind of into what I've been writing about. So we practice something we call neolocality. We all basically move out of our parents' houses, right? There's some of the cultures in the past had similar things, only it wasn't just you have to move out of the house, it's you have to get out of town. Wedmer has said the Calusa probably practiced what's called a Conical Clan or something to that nature, which structurally, the way that kinship system, the way you think about your family there system works, you kind of have to slough off the younger people or the older people, siblings, in order to maintain kind of power and authority. And in those kind of societies in the Pacific, you have a lot of long distance travel. So a reason for travel might not just be that we don't have enough food, it's that here and we have to move, it's that I can't stay here because my big brother said so.
Population does.
Yeah, or they can't, yeah, you can't do that. But even just, it's part of the ideology at that point, is an ideology of constantly moving people out. And then the Arawakan migration through the Caribbean looks like they were matrilineal, tracing their descent through the mother side. And ethnographically around the world, that's people on the move. That's because males go out and women, to make a broad generalization, that, my mom would beat me up about. The males go out and do things and the women kind of cluster and keep things safe. I'm not super familiar with this. I have colleagues who are, but that's one of the things that makes you really ask, how come we don't talk about these long distance trade networks on the Atlantic side? If people could settle in Rapa Nui in Easter Island, coming out of the Pacific, that is such an impossibly long voyage. I mean, if you put that in comparison to what makes Columbus look like he just kind of took a dinghy across a pond, there are people there just doing huge voyages, and they have different technology. We're talking about, there's no evidence in Florida or in the Caribbean that I know of outrigger canoes and sails. Okay, the modern DNA studies are really interesting, and they show a lot of historic stuff. The prehistoric DNA studies have some really odd effects, and within them they say things like, all this has to be taken with a grain of salt because We're only taking burials we only have access to burials from like elite contexts. There are some weird, looking at mitochondrial DNA, which is on the mom's side, there are some really weird signatures in the Caribbean. There are, I think, 4 main mitochondrial DNA markers in the New World, and the rarest one is there that only exists like elsewhere in like the Panama region. So it's mitochondrial DNA is kind of like the isotope data, where the more people get into it, the more it shows there's exchange and moving on scales we just don't think about now. And some of it has to do with, like I mentioned, how Cuba, the part of the barrier there is political. And when we do, in the islands, when you do archaeology, a lot of people do the archaeology of that island, rather than doing the archaeology of that island, the next one over, and the next one over, all the way back to the mainland. And if we talk about our typologies in Florida, you know, what we call even rock sources changes when you cross state lines sometimes. And what we call point types and pottery types changes across state lines. So a lot of this is kind of our ontology, is how we make these categories rather than it being what's really there. And I was talking about this with Bob earlier. If you're working in a university, you make your career by studying a thing, usually at a place. You know, you're rewarded for studying narrowly. The people in the past, like the Fuchs, Rouse, Goggins, Bullens, all these, you know, they studied all over the place because they could, and now that's not how you get funding. I mean, right now I'm working on a grant where it's looking at a very small piece of land, looking at a very particular piece of time, and even then it might be too broad with the themes I'm bringing in. So part of it's just the way how we're generating data and how we're thinking about it is we're not looking at these scales, and people dismiss looking at those scales as saying people in the past weren't smart enough to come up with the same technology in different places. That's the frequent critique, that you're being too diffusionistic. And you can level that, but I think that's kind of uncreative. I don't think it's not saying people in the past were dumb. Instead, it's saying people in the past were incredibly dynamic, and that's why they're moving around so much. Occasionally you hear about things and it gets knocked down. I'm really curious about some of the ground stone in South Florida that all got sourced to the Piedmont. They said in the paper, the people who looked at it, that they checked Cuban samples, but I don't know how many Cuban samples they checked. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the ground stone found at the mouth of the Miami River wasn't coming out of the really nice ground stone deposits in Cuba. You know, I'm saying all these things like we need to look at Cuba more, and I've only been there once in just one little area. It's not exactly something a lot of archaeologists are doing. So I can't say that there is really rock solid evidence of, you know, this artifact started its life history, if you will, in Cuba and ended up in Jacksonville. I don't have that in hand. And the person who does can write a nice little paper about it. Okay, well, thank you very much. I had a lot of fun.